This is Spirit Gym. The conversation in today's episode may inspire critical thinking. Paul is talking with Alec Zeck, a former Army captain turned independent researcher, podcaster, speaker, and writer. Together, they're exploring topics such as the misuse and misunderstanding of the scientific method in modern research, the failure of disciplines like virology, genetics, and cell biology to meet basic scientific rigor, and the importance of using holistic frameworks over reductionist, symptom-based models. They also dive into Alex's personal transformative story and the success his family have experienced with healing using natural methods. If you enjoy this episode with Paul and Alec, we invite you to explore the deeper levels of connection and conversation available in the Spirit Gym membership community. Go to myspiritgym.com for details. Before diving in, we'd just like to say thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures. You can find the special offers and discounts from the sponsors throughout this episode, or visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast.
Well, hello, everybody. As you heard from Penny's intro, we have a very exciting and interesting guest today, Alec Zeck. I've been wanting to get him on the podcast for a long time, and I finally was able to organize it with Alec. And today we're going to have a dialogue on the topic of thinking holistically and problem solving. And I think Alec has been making a lot of very important observations. I began listening to him at the beginning of COVID or sometime around that point, and I thought, finally, there's someone rational out there that's got a set of balls and tells things as they are. So we're going to continue that journey today. Alex, so great to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
It is an absolute honor, Paul. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're going to get into all sorts of stuff today, but as famous as you are, I suspect that with my podcast listeners being spread across 171 different countries with a wide variety of interests, some may not be familiar. So would you be open to sharing your developmental background, your chief interests, and maybe your spiritual philosophy, just so we can all kind of get a sense of who Alec is as we start our journey together?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a very, very, very summarized version of my background because that would be like a multi-part series. I grew up in a pretty chaotic, tumultuous environment, relatively speaking, relative to most other people in Western countries, which I'm grateful for, honestly. Like, just to give some context, like on the ACE score, which is the Adverse Childhood Event score, I score 13 out of 15. So I had a pretty gnarly childhood, but I'm very grateful for it. And I grew up playing basketball. Basketball is my life growing up. And the only Division I school that was actively recruiting me was the United States Military Academy at West Point. And I went to West Point, was never on the basketball team or anything like that, but ended up going there, graduating and commissioning as an Army officer. And while I was at West Point, my mom's health had become so, I guess you could say, just her health had taken a serious dive downwards. When I was younger, she was diagnosed with, multiple psychiatric conditions and put on multiple benzodiazepines and SSRIs under the care of multiple psychiatrists. And by the time I was graduating from West Point, her condition had become so bad that we were looking at permanently institutionalizing her. But she just happened to be seeing a therapist at the time who was reading A Mind of Your Own by Dr. Kelly Brogan. And my mom and, scheduled an appointment with Kelly in New York around the same time that I was graduating from West Point. Kelly still had a practice back then. And that changed the entire trajectory of our family, which led to my wife, who I had just gotten married to at the time. And we'd been together since we were 16. The entire time that I had known her, she was under the care of multiple rheumatologists with multiple so-called autoimmune conditions, lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, namely. And after seeing my mom begin to heal drastically for the first time ever, we decided to try the same very natural approach with her and she reversed both of her autoimmune conditions naturally in a matter of 4 months, and was off
Great.
all of her immunosuppressive drugs and things like this, and went to see a rheumatologist and had her blood work tested. And I'm skeptical of blood work now, but that's another story. But for the sake of the argument, at the time we bought into blood work pretty heavily, and all that to say, her blood work did show that her inflammation levels were normal for the first time in nearly 9 years. And the doctor came in and basically said, well, whatever immunosuppressive drugs and other things that we have you on, just keep continuing those. And we politely told him, well, we're actually not on any of the drugs. We've tapered off all of them, and she's doing the exact opposite of what you've consistently recommended and other rheumatologists have recommended, and she's healed. And at that moment, there was no intellectual curiosity or further questioning on part of the doctor. It was just sort of a shoulder shrug and saying, well, looks like you don't need me anymore. So at West Point, I majored in systems engineering, so I had a decent proficiency in reading scientific papers and understanding scientific material, so-called scientific material. So at that point, I began a deep dive into all things holistic health, natural health, after seeing what I had witnessed with my own two eyes with respect to my mom and then also my wife. And I never looked back. And by the time 2020 came around, I had done a tremendous amount of so-called childhood trauma healing, but just addressing some of the things that had occurred to me and some of the things I had done to other people by repeating those patterns early on in my life, and also had done a deep dive on a variety of topics. So by the time 2020 came around, I think I overwhelmingly was spot on in my perceptions of what was going on, and I began using my voice at that point in time. Whereas previously I was just a guy posting pictures of my son and my wife and myself on social media. Definitely did not have an audience by any means, but I started to grow an audience by speaking out authentically on my perceptions of what was going on in the world. So that's sort of my background. Now, in terms of my spiritual philosophy, I want to say first off, that is always evolving and changing. But in general, I would say the common thread is I do fundamentally believe that we live in a reality that is one, that all of this that we are experiencing is all one being modulating itself in an infinite number of unique ways.
Awesome.
And I think a layer below that, we live in the appearance of duality, and it is a purposeful appearance of duality. I think there are a lot of people in the non-dual space, so to speak, and I'm not saying that they're wrong or bad for doing this. It's just not my path, that want to escape the body, that want to leave the body, that want to forego entertaining or diving into anything in this realm of perceptive duality. And I personally think that, for me at least, that is a mistake. I think we're supposed to have the foundational context that we live in a universe that is one. We live in a reality that is fundamentally one, but bringing that context and that understanding of how interconnected we actually are, and that we are fundamentally one being, and love is the fundamental nature of this realm, and allowing that to inform ourselves as we navigate this necessary purposeful duality. And just as a quick other piece of my spiritual philosophy, I look back on all of the various traumas and emotional chaos and turmoil and all the things that I was exposed to in my childhood. And I recognize those, not immediately, but over the course of, dealing with these things, as catalysts, as opportunities for positive change, you could call it. And what that has done for me is made it so I can fully experience the richness and love and forgiveness and compassion and joy in just watching my daughter ride her bike, in sitting with my son as he's drawing a picture, in a way that I don't think I could have had I not experienced and then also done the work to transmute the various so-called negative things and hard things that I was exposed to. And I think that is ultimately one of the primary purposes of this illusion of separation, is so that we can experience the dark things to give us contrast, and so that we can know the richness of love, of compassion, and all those other things that I named. So that's a high-level overview of my spiritual framework, if you want to call it that, and my background. There's a lot more there, but that's mostly it.
Well, that's a beautiful introduction, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of the Luciferian influence on religion, but the Luciferian path, Steiner says, was introduced in the East. I can't remember exactly the time period, but he describes the Eastern religions largely as Luciferian, which is the concept of getting out of, to not participate in the illusion. And so you'll see Vedanta, all the non-dualist religions and philosophies are essentially Luciferian. And a couple of thoughts I wanted to share with you in that regard. Arthur M. Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter and a genius, took his money from all of his successes and developed an institute for the study of consciousness. And one of the things he makes very clear, because of the lack of clarity on this issue, and I believe it's in his excellent book, The Reflexive Universe, which if you haven't read, it's excellent. He says many people make the mistake of thinking that Maya means illusion and therefore do not want to get involved in life, which is exactly what you're referring to with the non-dualists. But he says we must understand that Maya does not mean illusion. It means the illusion. And that is the only way God can experience itself, through the illusion. And I won't go into everything I share in Spirit Gym about that because it would be too complex and more than we want to get into, so we can talk about other things. But what many people don't realize is that by definition, God is that for which there is no other. If there's an other, then you don't have God. God is the only being that can create and sustain itself. None of us can do that. We all have to eat, drink, we all have to have relationships. But God's essentially all alone, entirely alone. If you ask most any religious person if God is love, pretty much all of them will say yes. And if you ask, is the highest form of love unconditional love, most everyone I've ever talked to, and that's a lot of people with over 63,000 students, they'll say yes. But what they don't realize is that which is unconditional cannot know itself, because to know anything is a condition. So paradoxically, God dreams itself into existence to create a perceptible other. The Tantra myth of Shiva and Shakti is probably the most beautiful of all that I've seen for explaining that. And in that relationship, then God sees the beauty of Shakti, and in so doing, gives Shakti what we would call subject. And then her relationship with God is God becomes the object of her devotion. She becomes the object of his devotion. She dreams Shiva into existence, and between the two of them, so Shakti says, I want a lover, a consort, and a friend. And so in the story, Shakti and Shiva give birth to everything that is creation itself. So Shiva is the name that represents all things created. Shakti is infinite intelligence and infinite energy, God's own womb. She is the womb of creation. Point being is that in order for there to be love, you have to have a lover and a beloved. You have to have a subject, the lover, and the beloved, the object of your devotion. And my deep many years of research into this shows paradoxically that is actually the origin of mind. You cannot have a mind without 2 points of sentience that are exchanging energy and information. And a computer is just an information process because it's not sentient. It doesn't care if you're building an atom bomb or coming up with a cure for cancer. It doesn't know the difference. It just processes symbols. So once we have love, which I define love is the flow of energy and information through empathic and compassionate connection to self and or other. Now, like right now, you and I are sharing the flow of energy and information, and we're empathic and compassionate about the situation that humanity's in and about how to help people and grow ourselves. So we're sharing love, and in the process, we create a mind together. So the non-dual approach is actually overlooking the absolute necessity of duality for the creation of love and relationship, and unity has no function without individuality, just like a bicycle wheel is useless without its individual spokes. So God's like the hub, the axle, and we're like the spokes, and the unity of us all, Great Spirit, is the rim.
Yeah.
And mind is the relationship between the spokes, the rim, and the axle.
Right. I love that you said that too, because I've used the spider web analogy, and this is to add to what you said, the difference between pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism, the premise is that there is only God with no distinction. Whereas panentheism is that there is a distinct God that is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all the omnis, right? That we are inextricably linked to, fundamentally a part of, but we as individuated aspects of it are not that. We are not fully that. We are inextricably linked to it. And I think like it's paradoxically both.
It is I was going to say.
It is paradoxically both, but I think that if one takes the approach of pantheism, it can lead to the non-dual perspective. Not always, but it can lead to the non-dual perspective where they don't want to interact with reality, versus panentheism sort of recontextualizes this appearance, this very real, like you said, the illusion. It recontextualizes it as purposeful, but we are still drawing from and inextricably linked to, fundamentally a part of God. But God is the all-knowing, all-present, all-loving creator that is distinct from us.
Yeah, I would share a view there, Alec, and that is this. Personally, I'm both. I'm a panentheist and a pantheist. But as a pantheist, there's a difference between reading about this stuff and having authentic experiences of union with God, for which I've had too many to count. And they began early. But when you have an authentic experience of God, and you really experience the beauty, the power, the intensity, and the mind-blowing experience of feeling unconditional love, and you then re-enter the world, and you realize that everything and everyone is God, manifest in its own dream for its own self-realization, because God as unconditional love cannot possibly know itself, because by definition, a self is a condition. The one is God's self, and we're all part of it, just like you're made of a collection of cells and organs and glands and tissues that you walk around thinking is Alec Zeck, but you can talk to any one of them if you direct your consciousness to it. But the point I'm making is that one of the challenges of religion is most people that are in religions just memorize scriptures and ideas, and then you end up getting a bunch of mental masturbation over whose idea is right. But religion really was intended by the founders of each of the religions to bring you into the numinous, into the mystery of God, into the experience of God. And this is why Nietzsche said God is dead, because when they concretized all the rites and all the practices and all the symbols as objective signs that they were the experts on and nobody else could know anything, it took the mystery right out of religion, and therefore it took the quest of the heart and the openness of perception and experience and being aware of the beauty of all of it around you. And so religion just became an indoctrination system, and that's the problem. But the deeper issue is whether one's a panentheist, a pantheist, an atheist, or any other derivation, these are all myths. And when you really understand what myth means, the most powerful definition of myth is the story that tells itself. Well, the story is life, and only God can tell that story. So you have to say, well, if God is the great storyteller, telling the story of life, which includes my story. And if, as an expression of the divine, I have the same creative abilities within me, then I too can become a co-creator, which means a conscious relationship with God, and your life will mirror back your myth to you, right? So like you said about your family childhood, I had one just like that. When you grow enough to see it in context and heal and look for the beauty of it, then you're co-creating your myth. You're going from a victim to a co-creator. And so to be conscious of the power of your license as a co-creator in myth and to participate in the grand divine drama is really why we're all here, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. I don't have anything to add to that.
One thing I wanted to point out too with blood draws is over my many years of doing blood work and analysis of everything you can imagine, and I did 3 years of training with the actual inventor of salivary hormones, Bill Timmons. I've done a number of double blood draws where I draw my blood twice, put my name on it and a fake name on the other one, and have them analyzed. And in every case, they look like two completely different people.
That's exactly my point. That is literally the exact point that I was getting at when I said the blood panel.
Yeah. Have you ever read the book Biochemical Individuality by Roger Williams, PhD?
I've not.
It'll blow your mind. I highly recommend it.
I got to write that down. What is it again?
Biochemical Individuality.
Okay.
By Roger Williams, PhD. He essentially shows that we're as different on the inside as we are on the outside. For example, he shows 19 different structures of the stomach that he found in human beings. But what I think you'll find really interesting is Roger Williams shows how the medical system basically continued to set parameters for blood draws and any kind of testing that were so narrow that almost anyone that took any kind of test in a medical situation would need a drug or some kind of a procedure. And he shows, for example, that you can have Eskimos with a total cholesterol of 1,000 that are completely and utterly healthy, and that our whole ideology around blood levels has been totally manipulated and not driven by truth, but by the medical pursuit of gaining your money.
Well, it's also based in like highly assumption-based speculation based in correlation, ultimately. That's the problem. There is no direct cause and effect link with a lot of these things. And that's the problem with many so-called scientific fields these days. They don't actually adhere to the scientific method, observing a natural phenomenon for which you try to find the cause of the observed natural phenomenon.
Right.
Well, I have one more thing to add too, in addition to that, like on my perspective of blood work. Like, I'm not saying that blood work with also a clear approach of getting to know the story of the individual that is in front of you, and I'm speaking from the lens of a practitioner. I'm not claiming to know everything about being a practitioner. I'm not a practitioner myself. But if you're just taking blood work to dictate how you approach someone who is coming to you with various health issues, it is a major slippery slope, because that blood work is subject to change the very next minute, the very next hour, the very next day, in addition to what you also said, Paul. But the body is constantly fluctuating. And ultimately, if we're just looking things purely at on a biochemical basis, it's going to be inherently flawed. And that's what blood work is based in the false understanding that we are purely biochemical beings. There's so much more to us than meets the eye.
Yeah, there's another real issue with all such tests, and I teach this to my students in their training. And my institute's multidisciplinary, so we've got medical doctors, chiropractors, osteopaths, nurses, physical therapists, strength coaches, personal trainers, acupuncturists, you name it. So I basically set up a system where I encourage everybody to learn from each other, to recognize when it is that you need an acupuncturist or a neurologist or a endocrinologist or a physical therapist, etc. But basically I cross-educate people so they can all become better at knowing when they need help, because I don't think any one of us knows enough to deal with the common problems that most people come in with. And so I think having multidisciplinary knowledge is critical. And then sharing with each other is critical. But the point I'm leading to here is that when I'm teaching, I often will put the results of people's tests up. And I'll say, okay, look, here's someone who's got a very disturbed 24-hour cortisol rhythm, and they're in stage 3 adrenal exhaustion. So you're going to now get told by some book or doctor that's going to say, give them licorice root, pregnenolone, do this, do that. But not one bit of that has ever addressed the issue of how that cortisol level got disrupted. What are the traumas that they haven't healed? What's their diet and lifestyle like? What's their relationships like? How's their financial status? How's their sense of self-love and self-respect? And if you don't look at those factors, then what you're doing is you're still treating symptoms, and you're not really addressing root causes, which is kind of like shaping us up for what we're really heading towards here. So in my sort of the thing I want to ask you next is, how big of a problem do you feel it is today because people do not have holistic thinking and problem solving skills?
Oh, it's a horrible problem. I mean, one of the main things that I'd like to get into, and I just wrote a long, I guess you could say, article on this morning, is what I alluded to a little bit ago with respect to the scientific method, and how many people, even outside of so-called health sciences, are buying into things that are passed off as empirical evidence and so-called scientific knowledge that are still fundamentally based in unproven assumptions and belief. And I don't know if this would be an appropriate time to get into my sort of framework for thinking.
Hey, man, you're the rule.
Okay, got it.
Fire away.
Got it. Okay. So I was sort of put on the spot by a good friend of mine who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kelly Brogan, when she interviewed me for her podcast. And I sort of came up with this on the spot because I've never been able to fully, or I had never been able to fully articulate like how it is that I think, because people are constantly telling me how much they appreciate how I think. And I'm like, I don't even know how I think, but I kind of, I don't know. I kind of came up with a framework, a loose framework on the spot. So the first piece of this is that the neti principle is a principle for seeking one's true identity. It's sort of a Vedic principle, and it means not this, not that. And it's trying to get to the true essence of who and what you are. But that can also be used as a means to just think about the nature of this reality, or cause and effect claims, or someone's arguments. You can borrow from that, in that a way to think, or the way that I've come to think, is thinking by means of falsification. Meaning that when someone makes a claim about something, when some organization makes a claim about something, when some so-called expert gets on the TV and makes a claim about something, a paper is published, et cetera, you can approach that to figure out if it's true based on falsifying. And there are 3 ways that I've contextualized how I falsify. So again, it's seeking truth by means of falsification. So not this, not that. Analyzing claims, various claims, and trying to get to the bottom of what is true. And the premise is that what you're left with as you continue to falsify, is closer to what is true. I won't say that that means that it is objective truth, but it's likely closer to what is true on any given argument. So when it comes to thinking of the body, or falsification of the body, we employ empiricism. We employ something like the scientific method, which is all about falsifying hypotheses that are derived by observing naturally occurring phenomena. So, for example, when it comes to so-called infectious diseases, you could say a real observed natural phenomenon is two or more people getting sick in the same space. Even calling it infectious diseases is an assumption in and of itself. But what we're talking about here is two or more people getting sick in the same space with similar symptoms, right? So that's an observed natural phenomenon. So right now we're talking about the scientific method, which is a tool you can employ to determine the knowing of the body, the falsification of the body through empiricism. Okay, so after you have an observed natural phenomenon, two or more people getting sick in the same space, you come up with a hypothesis for that observed natural phenomenon. In this case, it might be, I think particles, submicroscopic particles, or let's be more specific with our definition, an obligate intracellular parasite consisting of a proteinaceous coat surrounding a core of genetic material, which is the definition for a virus, is passing from one person to another, causing disease in healthy people, causing sick people, causing healthy people to become sick by these little particles being passed. Okay, in order to test that hypothesis, you need the independent variable, your presumed cause, which in this case is that definition that I just gave for a virus. So in order to even begin to test your hypothesis, you need the presumed cause to vary and manipulate to see if it produces the effect. Because you're essentially saying, I think X causes Y. I think virus causes two or more people to get sick in the same space, right? So in order to test that, you need virus. When it comes to virology, just as an example, and this is again falsification, they have never, ever determined that they have X. They assume that X is inside the fluids of a sick person. I know you've had Dr. Cowan on. I know you've had Daniel Reuters on, so I won't belabor the point here.
And Dr. Kaufman, yeah.
Yeah. So I won't belabor the point here, but this is an example of approaching truth by means of falsification, employing the scientific method. And there are countless fields of so-called established science that fail to adhere to the scientific method, meaning they don't have a properly identified independent variable to vary and manipulate to see if it produces the observed natural phenomenon in question. What I mean by that is they don't have the thing they think is the cause of the observed natural phenomenon in order to see if it is indeed the cause of the observed natural phenomenon. They rely on so-called scientific modeling. They rely on epidemiological observations, which is, again, not direct evidence. And it's not to say that those things aren't useful, but when someone is making an assertion or making a positive claim about something that requires that you follow their guidelines associated with that claim, it would behoove of you to employ something like the scientific method and deeply understand it to falsify on the level of the body.
Well, hello, everybody. Did you know the most common questions I get by far are questions about where to get what I use, be that clothing, foods, herbs, coffee, gym gear, self-help items, supplements, art supplies, and more. Because I'm a man that is a connoisseur of everything I enjoy using, such as my stereo and great music, I love helping others find fulfillment the way I do. That's why I've launched my new Paul Recommends area on my website. Now, anyone that wants to know what my connoisseur's choices are can find the best of the best quickly and easily. If you want to know what my recommendations are, please go to paulchek.com/shop/Paul-recommends and join me and all my friends that are connoisseurs in enjoying the best. Well, absolutely. I've got a few notes written down I will share and invite you to respond to.
Okay, and then there's the level of the mind, and then also the level of the spirit too, which I would like to get into.
Well, yeah, we can go to that. I just don't want to get so far ahead. I have 4 pages of notes to go over with you.
Let's go over your questions first.
Well, there are more comments. One issue. Well, first I'll give you 2 quotes. If all you got in your pocket is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's one of the problems with the medical system. Next one. It's very hard to change a man's belief system when their paycheck depends on it.
Amen.
And so we have those 2 issues, right? The medical system has become so specialized, it's like a carpenter with nothing in their toolbox but a hammer. So everything appears to be a nail to them. And that's a serious problem in the medical system worldwide, because as specialization has grown, which now you got an orthopedic expert on every part of the body, from the hand to the foot to the shoulder to the and so what happens is, one, they hardly ever talk to each other, and none of them understand functional anatomy. I've been working with these people for my entire life, and I can count on half of one hand the doctors that actually understand what the psoas muscle really does, outside of just a cadaver version of it.
Well, just to give some more indication of how big of a deal this is, to understand the importance of when someone makes a claim, especially if it's coming from a so-called expert, a government organization, or something like this, to hold their feet to the fire, you could say, with respect to their claim, seeing if it actually holds up to scrutiny with something like the scientific method. For example, the field of genetics. There is no direct cause and effect relationship established. No one has ever been able to show an actual nucleotide. No one has been able to show with empirical evidence that genetics are the cause for any of the various diseases that genetics are blamed for. And when it comes to the double helix model, that is an assumed model based on X-ray crystallography. Another one is with respect to cell biology, which is a so-called well-established scientific field. The structures of a cell, many of them are assumed to exist based on electron micrograph images. And then further, when we're talking about assuming that what is done to a cell in a dish represents what happens in a complex being such as us, is a major assumption that so many people
don't look at,
assume is correct because it is done by so-called authority figures.
Yes. And that was one of my points, was in my career, what I've seen over and over again is it's extremely rare that there is a single cause that leads to a person's health challenges, diseases, emotional trauma, mental emotional disruption, et cetera, et cetera. We are usually dealing with compound influences, and the nervous system summates stress. It does not have a mechanism. The whole nervous system processes all proprioceptive, nociceptive, and extraceptive inputs in parallel. Your conscious mind processes in series, but your brain and nervous system are parallel processors, and there's not one single cell in your body that's not aware of what every single other cell is doing. If you really understand even the motor system, your abductor digiti quinti in your little toe knows what your orbicularis oculi is doing at all times through the spindle cell system and the proprioceptive system and various other mechanisms. So we always have to be conscious of the fact that it makes people feel good when the doctor says, this is what's wrong with you, because it gives them a sense of hope or a sense of ease. But the number of times that turns out to be the beginning of a long series of drugs and surgeries and toxicity and trauma that leads to bigger and bigger and bigger problems. And I've spent my career dealing with medical failures, so I'm very familiar with this whole conundrum where if we don't pay attention to these factors and we keep doing bogus medicine, and that leads to my next point, which is the highest standard of authentication in medicine is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. But what that really means in lay terms, it's extreme isolation of a hormone or of a function or of a cell or of a system, which they call the gold standard. And when I have questioned scientists and doctors on why is that the gold standard when that has nothing to do with how the body works, the most common answer I get is because the body's so complex, there's no other way we can study it. I see. So why don't you tell that truth instead of leading people to the illusion that you're actually doing gold standard research? And I can give you a good example of this. I don't know if you know who Stuart McGill is. Well, he's a guy that is a professor at a university in Canada in Toronto. I think it's McGill University, or one of the major universities there. But his theories of core control are very opposed to mine, and he has gone on radio shows and said that, my approach is wrong, blah, blah, blah. So anyhow, he was attacking me one time at a conference, and I asked him, I said, how in the world can you do effective research on motor function with EMG studies without first normalizing people to determine if they have posture or normal motor function, so you have a control group? Mm-hmm. And I said, how in the world, if you study anatomy and you realize that the visceral system borrows its sensory nerve endings from the musculoskeletal system, and all organs share their pain with muscles, which disrupts the motor functioning of the whole kinetic system, can you possibly tell me that you can isolate any muscle without looking at the function of the internal systems of the body?
Right.
And he said to me, well, that's true, but we don't have any technologies capable of doing that. I said, that's bullshit. I can show you about 50 of them. I do it all the time. One of them is paying attention to what the person's symptoms are and using a health appraisal questionnaire that identifies key markers of liver stress, kidney stress, etc., and then asking about what's going on in their life and looking for the correlations. Every doctor knows that nobody comes to the office complaining that their heart hurts. They always say, I have chest pain and pain down my left arm. Women commonly have low back pain with menstruation, pain down their legs, even sciatic pain. So there's a long list of medical symptoms where for example, a gallbladder can cause pain behind the right knee. So doctors know this, so it's like half their brain knows it, but the other half their brain shuts it out. And so my point is, I said to McGill, so what you're doing is you're publishing research that is incorrectly done and encouraging university students and everyone else in your audiences to believe it as though it's fact, when really it's not factual or true at all. And You're criticizing me because I include a holistic analysis of the body, and you don't want to have to admit that you're wrong. And he basically nodded his head. He didn't say I agree, but so this is the issue we're dealing with right here. And then before we get too far into the next things, because I'm very interested in mind and spiritual associations with all this stuff, one of the things I really wanted to ask you, and I've asked others like Sayer G this, there's a ton of research on, as you know, on manipulating viruses, gain of function. There's a lot of stuff in even natural health literature, such as warts being from viruses. So even though the idea may not be correct, there is some kind of a mechanism that seems to be happening, because there's quite a lot of things that people get that are attributed to virus, such as the herpes virus. So my question is, if it's not a virus, what is your thoughts about what the function might be? Now, Tom Cowan, he says it's toxicity. Sayer G speaks of exosomes, as do others. Steiner said something interesting that I thought you might like to know about if you haven't heard it. Steiner did not know about genes or viruses from the standard medical parlance, because he was gone before that research really came out. But what Steiner said is that whenever there is excessive stress in nature, the organisms in that area will begin to break down, and their cells will, in the breakdown process, will leak information out to the environment, and the other plants, trees, animals, beings will pick up that information and upgrade their adaptability to that stressor because now they know what's coming. And so one of the things that I've seen is that a good analogy is if you have an old computer, like say you've got a 10-year-old computer and you try to upload a software program that's too advanced for it, requires too much RAM, etc., it'll crash the computer. So one of the things that I saw with COVID is that when people got the vaccine or got whatever illness hit them, that they did not have enough nutrition on board, enough energy on board, and enough vitality to upgrade the system, which could have been a detox reaction. It could have been a cellular biochemical adaptation. And so they crashed. And that's what we call maybe the COVID illness. I don't know. But anyhow, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on A, if not a virus, what do you think's happening? And B, how do you feel about Steiner's conception?
So I know first off that Paul, you're incredibly knowledgeable on this. So a lot of this will be rhetorical for you, but
that's
I'm
okay. It's good for the audience.
Tailor it for your audience. That's the whole point of this. So I want to close out my thoughts with respect to what you just said there regarding authority figures and their so-called scientific pursuits. So it's ironic because what I was trying to get at is many accepted fields of science aren't actually scientific in their foundations. Pseudoscience is anything claiming to be scientific that doesn't strictly adhere to the scientific method. The countless things that I just named, genetics, cell biology, virology, the germ quote theory, even though it's not a theory, it's a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis that has been thoroughly falsified at this point. They're not well-established scientific fields, although we think of them as that because they don't actually adhere to the scientific method, follow the scientific method. They're not directly proving any sort of cause and effect relationship. Now, with that being said, another point to emphasize with respect to virology is the burden of proof lies on the individual making the positive claim, meaning those that say X causes Y, the onus is on them to prove that X causes Y. This is actually a maxim of law. A very childlike example you could give is if Bill is killed by, or Johnny's being brought up on murder charges for killing Bill. Someone said that they saw someone that looked just like Johnny leaving his apartment complex. CCTV footage at a local gas station shows someone that appears to be the same stature of Johnny and has the same truck as Johnny drive up and shoot and kill Bill point blank range on March 14th, 2024 in Madison, Wisconsin. The problem is, on that exact same date, Johnny has verifiable evidence that he was actually in Costa Rica. He has plane receipts, he has restaurant receipts, he has all the things to demonstrate that he was in Costa Rica. He did an Instagram live that day that's recorded. He has a bunch of pictures, et cetera, thus falsifying the positive claim that Johnny is the reason that Bill died. It would be absolutely insane if, in the face of that, the judge, the jury, the prosecutor was like, you know what? You're right. We can't find anyone else, or it's clearly not you. You have thoroughly falsified this idea that you are the reason that Bill died. But you're the, quote, best fit model, and until you can come up with a better explanation for what did cause Bill to die, we're just going to go with you because all of our mathematical modeling and our indirect evidence is the best fit model that we have right now. So even though you falsified several aspects of that, we're just going to stick with you until you can show us what did cause Bill to die. So
you realize the problem is that that's happening all the time.
That's my point. This is exactly my point.
That's exactly what we call our legal system, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I know. It's funny because that is literally what's happening in the legal system, despite it being that they're innocent until proven guilty. Supposedly, what this is countless examples like this. But I do this too. You do this too. Countless people do this in our day-to-day life where we buy into what is still an unproven belief system, whether that's cell biology, genetics, virology, infectious diseases,
or God.
Even though multiple aspects of those things have been thoroughly falsified, because we cannot sit in the uncomfortable, you know what, I don't know for sure what is the cause of this phenomenon. We go with what is the, quote, accepted, quote, best fit model because a bunch of people and a bunch of so-called authority figures and experts believe in it and give their so-called scientific consensus related to it, despite, again, several pieces of it being falsified. So, with that being said, even though the burden of proof lies on the individual making the positive claim, that's not to say it cannot be useful to provide other plausible explanations, possible explanations for what does cause a phenomenon. So, going back to virology, I want to emphasize this again. Virology is not an established field of science. It does not adhere to the scientific method in its foundational evidence. Multiple aspects of that have been falsified by the likes of Dr. Stefan Lanka, showing that the same effect that the virologists point to as, quote, evidence, again, the foundational so-called evidence of a virus, can be achieved without introducing any human sample, which is what is assumed to contain virus particles in the first place, following the exact same so-called isolation procedure that virologists follow without any possible source of virus present, get the same exact results, thus falsifying, even though the burden of proof is still on them, falsifying this idea that cytopathic effect in culture is evidence of a virus. Likewise, and I know you've had Daniel Roitis on, he's scoured the scientific literature covering over 200 studies that have been done throughout history, attempting to demonstrate the idea that healthy people become sick when exposed to sick people or their bodily fluids. And the overwhelming majority of those studies failed. The modal, most frequently occurring result was zero contagion. So now I'm setting that as the context, just in case someone has not listened to Daniel Roitis on your show, Tom Cowan, Andy Kaufman. Virology and really the germ theory of disease has been thoroughly falsified. Now, that means we're back to the drawing board on what might cause the phenomenon of two or more people getting sick in the same space.
And also, I'd like you to address what is gain-of-function research if the virology issue is falsified.
Yes, absolutely. I can address that to the best that I can, let's say. Let's address that first, since it's top of mind, and that's something that seems very important in this day and age with what's going on in the world. So I first want to address this idea that gain of function itself was censored. That is true, but I've done this, several other people have done this, custom Google searches, where if you put in the date range from December 2019 through May of 2020 on Google, type in gain of function SARS-CoV-2, gain of function COVID, gain of function Wuhan Institute of Virology, Wuhan, China, et cetera, you will find countless mainstream news sources that are openly discussing the idea of a gain of function lab-made virus. Yes, it was then censored thereafter, but only after this idea was seeded amongst the population. And in a bit, I'll get to the nocebo effect, mass psychogenic illness, social contagion, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not making the claim that all these labs are embezzling money and it's just a money laundering scheme and things like this. I can't say I know with certainty what exactly is going on in these labs, but there are published gain of function studies that we can look at and determine what exactly is going on. So doctors Mark and Sam Bailey, and then also my friend Mike Stone from virology.com, which is an incredible resource.
That sounds good just by the title.
Yeah, virology, L-I-E-G, so virology, but with a lie in the middle of it, .com, have done some incredible deep dives on so-called gain-of-function research. And what you find when you look at the published literature on so-called gain-of-function research is that it's all based in assumption-based animal models, where they'll take, for example, a ferret, and maybe this ferret that's raised in a lab environment under fluorescent lights, possibly exposed to other experiments, eating an unnatural diet, in a perpetual state of fight or flight, and induce symptoms in this ferret by taking a cell culture, a muck of stuff from a cell culture, which contains antibiotics, antimycotics of various types, gentamicin, amphotericin B, possibly trypsin in some cases. It contains decaying tissue from another being that was excised from said being, and then they'll inject it directly into the ferret, right?
Yeah.
And then this ferret will start developing symptoms of illness, right? They'll then take the nasal secretions, or they'll take literally the nasal tissue from that ferret, grind it up, and inject it into another ferret. And many times the second ferret doesn't actually show any symptoms. And then they'll continue repeating this process until the other ferret does end up showing some symptoms. And sometimes they'll use a rat, sometimes they'll use a rabbit. But the point is, this is essentially what is done in so-called gain-of-function experiments that are published. And then you have to kind of understand viral genomics, of which I do not claim to be any sort of expert, but I do know that the way viral, quote, viral genomes are assembled is by taking nucleic acids, random sequences of nucleic acids that are extracted from a sample of snot, of which there are millions and millions and millions of possible sources for that genetic material, an unfiltered sample of snot, and then uploading them into various computer programs where they'll do an algorithmic process to assemble these nucleic acids based on templates of other so-called, quote, viruses, which were isolated in the exact same way that I described earlier. So it's all circular reasoning based in the assumption that they actually exist in the first place. Never is there a, quote, viral genome coming directly from an isolated viral particle. It's always coming from a muck of genetic material, much of which is of unknown origin, especially because the scientific establishment willingly acknowledges that the human genome hasn't even been fully mapped. So setting that aside for a second, what happens with these ferrets is once they induce symptoms in this second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth ferret via these unnatural means of taking material and injecting it directly into them, right? They will then sequence the genetic material. And they will find, based on these templates, that the genetic material is a certain percentage different than the genetic material found in the initial ferret. And because it's all based in circular reasoning, they will then assume, oh, this must mean this is a morphed version of the, quote, original virus that was in the original ferret. And that's what's happened here. We have done, quote, gain of function on this virus, which is assumed to exist in the first place,
right,
and assumed to have been the cause of disease in the initial ferret. And because they find genetic material that is slightly different in this algorithmic assembly process, they then erroneously conclude that they have altered the, quote, original virus, and there is a, quote, new version of this virus in the second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth ferret. Now, that is a very abbreviated, summarized version of what happens in, quote, gain-of-function experiments based on the published research. Highly recommend checking out a paper by Dr. Mark Bailey, called A Farewell to Virology, where he goes into detail on so-called viral genomics, showing how fallacious and how ridiculous and assumption-driven that whole paradigm is. But that is what gain-of-function research is based on the published evidence. The last thing that I'll say is that a lot of people refer to the work of Dr. David Martin to lend credence to this idea that SARS-CoV-2 came from a lab, that they're working on other viruses, that the whole lab leak paradigm, right?
Yeah.
I interviewed Dr. David Martin for my podcast about 2 years ago, episode 40, and I can give that to you to link in the show notes. It took 45 minutes of direct question asking, but after pressing a few times, he admitted that there is not and never has been a transmissible particle related to gain of function. That there is not and never has been a transmissible virus or particle. There is nothing being passed from person to person as it pertains to gain of function research. It is more about, this is what he goes into later on, deriving synthetic sequences for the creation of these injectable products. That's what gain of function is related to. It has nothing to do with the creation of a transmissible particle or virus, which was really cool for him to admit on my podcast.
Well, it's not only cool for him to admit it, but because, as you alluded to, he is speaking about gain of function more as though it's very, very real.
Yep.
So commonly,
Well, and that's, this is getting a little bit on like my personal take on that. And I don't want to like speculate on intentions or anything like that, but it was a very tense interview. Let's just put it that way.
Well, he's a pretty high-wired dude,
Yeah, it was a very tense interview though, because I would ask the question in a variety of ways, and then he seemed to go on these sort of long diatribes about, well, based on what they say, and I'm like, that I get what you're saying, but I'm not trying to figure out based on what they say. I'm trying to figure out what is in reality, because that matters, especially if people are taking what you're relaying based on what they say to mean that that is actually happening in reality. I think it's really important to clarify, especially because people are tremendously fearful of this idea of a lab-made virus. And it's almost worse than the, quote, natural version of virus, which is also unproven, by the way, because which sounds scarier? The idea that a virus jumps from a bat to a pangolin in a 1 in a gazillion chance, and then some lady ate bat soup. I don't remember the exact story, but that, or the idea that they're taking the natural version of that, which again is unproven in the first place, and then manipulating it and weaponizing it in a lab with millions and billions of dollars being poured into it, shrouded
millions and billions of our fucking dollars.
Right, exactly.
That's the third factor.
Exactly. And so the point is, obviously the latter is much scarier. And unfortunately, in this day and age, buying into this sort of false dilemma, I'd love to get into the Cartman drama triangle at some point later on. We still have to go over the mind and the spirit. But the point is that the overwhelming majority of the health freedom movement, because they don't know how to employ what I just said based on challenging things as it pertains to the scientific method, challenging claims in accordance with the scientific method, especially if they're claims that are said to be scientific and based in, quote, cause and effect claims. This caused this gain of function virus causes symptoms. How do you know that? Okay, let's employ the scientific method. Has this been established in accordance with the scientific method? No. Okay, then we're back to the drawing board on what might be the cause of this observed natural phenomenon. So that's my whole spiel on gain of function. I covered, I think, everything.
What do you reach for when you need a snack to keep you going between meals? Here at the Chek household, we always have a selection of Paleo Valley's meat sticks close at hand. They are made from 100% grass-fed beef and venison or pasture-raised pork and chicken, and they contain organic spices to create flavors like buffalo-style chicken, jalapeno beef, and maple bacon pork. Paleo Valley's meat sticks are naturally fermented, so they are shelf-stable without the use of icky chemicals or questionable ingredients. Did you know that virtually all other similar snack stick products use GMO corn-based citric acid encapsulated in hydrogenated oils to process their products? Who wants to be eating that? Paleo Valley's meat sticks taste amazing and are good for you too, packed with protein and also gut-friendly probiotics created by the fermentation process. Paleo Valley sources from USA family farmers focused on using regenerative farming practices. This type of farming helps produce more nutrient-dense, nourishing meat while supporting the local ecosystem by helping rebuild topsoil, improve biodiversity, and sequester carbon while avoiding the use of chemicals and pesticides. So if you're looking for a snack that is good for you, good for the environment, and good for your budget, go to paleovalley.com/Chek15 and get 15% off your order of Paleo Valley meat sticks. That's paleovalley.com/CHEK15 for a 15% savings. Snack and be happy.
I just have a couple things. One, very good. Thank you. That's actually the best explanation I've ever heard. Go, Alex. You should get an honorary MD, honorary research doctorate. I think most of us out here are grateful that, you've done what you've done. As you can imagine, as the therapist and life coach for many professional athletes and, wealthy business moguls and movie stars or whatever, when all this pandemic started, my phone was ringing off the hook. People going, what should I do? What should I do? I'm going to lose my job, so Angie and I each probably did about 1,000 hours of research, which is how I came across you and many others. But, you get into this sort of a cul-de-sac type situation where you follow one lead and it takes you here, then you get into a kind of a corner and you can't go further than that. And, it's Tom Cowan's word versus someone else's word.
Right.
So at the end of the day, this is why, I really wanted to organize our dialogue today around holistic thinking. And I teach my students at very minimum, when you're facing an issue like this or anything important in your life, you have to answer who. who is the vaccine for, or who does this medical procedure or this food, etc., apply to? What is it for? When should you use it? Why should you use it? And how does it work? And I always say, look into the history of these things. What's the history of vaccines and their success and failures, etc.? You have to look at what's happened in the past and what is the circumstance in the present, and does the present situation match the past situation, or is it past information being used to promote something in the present that ultimately may not be the right solution for you or help you, right? The other thing that you didn't mention, but it's very important, is when they're doing all this research on mice and rats and ferrets and everything else, that's fucking super stressful for these creatures to be completely isolated, getting needles poked into them, oftentimes having surgical procedures. And, I can give you an example. If we look at how stress affects even people in the same family, you can have, say, a financial crisis, and mom gets an ulcer, dad has chronic constipation and headaches, Susie has terrible rashes all over her skin, and Bobby hurts his back exercising and now is laid out, and all of them are really reacting to the same stressful milieu, but they're each having an independent reaction. And so when you start taking animals out of their natural environment and you completely and utterly stress the shit out of them, any one system in their body or multiple systems could start to break down. And you'll be very familiar with this. When I was in basic training in the Army, it's almost like a great research environment because, my company had 250 guys in it. I think each platoon's around 50. And in my company, 4 guys tried to commit suicide because the stress of basic training was so high that they didn't want to have to face a disgrace of bombing out and going home, the failure. And some guys got very sick. You saw such a wide variety of reactions, but here's an environment where we're eating the same food, we're on the same schedule day and night, we're doing the same exercises. It's a very good control group. And I always, as a therapist and research person who's always studying the research, and even I've helped design multiple research projects in my career, I'm looking at this and going this is a good example of the fact that we all respond very differently due to psychological factors, due to family history factors, due to biochemical factors, mental emotional factors. And, people don't look at that stuff. And my last comment before I turn you loose again is this is exactly the same bullshit that's going on with global warming.
100%.
They're using computer-generated models to predict and scare the shit out of you and try to carbon tax you. And if anyone's interested in that, Greg Braden did a great podcast with Danica Harris. And Greg Braden, who is a geologist and has worked for NASA and understands the modeling and the computer systems they use, shows you exactly how they're making all these predictions. And I just watched a phenomenal presentation by a guy from the Electric Universe. I don't have time to dig it up, but he went through all the findings of the ice cores around the world. And he showed very clearly that the whole concept of global warming is absolute bullshit. And he used ice core records going back thousands and thousands of years. They have the ice cores, they can go back 300,000-400,000 years. And so, and it was a very, very good. In fact, Alex, I will make sure I text you that because I think you're going to dig it. It's really well done.
Please do. Yeah, please do. That's like a perfect example of what I failed to mention earlier after I forget exactly what you said, but I'll just go ahead and say it. So if I'm painting, or if I come across this amazing piece of art, this beautiful canvas, who is the only individual that knows the intention, the meaning, and the interworkings of that canvas?
The one that painted it.
The one that painted it, right. And how ridiculous is it to assume that human beings, again, I'm not going to say that we're inherently or, always limited as we think. We are more miraculous, more beautiful, more brilliant than we could ever imagine.
We need to focus on that more too.
Right. But with our various sources of conditioning, some intentional, right? Some purposeful, even again, going through that veil of forgetting, if you want to call it that. We don't know the whole canvas. And so any of these models that are these like epidemiological-based models trying to predict outcomes are flawed at their core because they assume that we as human beings, with our limited capacity to know, can know the exact interworkings of this canvas of life that only the creator itself can possibly know.
Yes. It's really, I'm sure you've seen the picture before of the 7 Hindu wise men that are blindfolded and they're all feeling an elephant.
Yeah, exactly.
One says, oh, this is a tree. The other one's pushing on its belly. Oh, this is a wall. Oh, this is a fire hose.
Yeah.
And they all have their own, logical rationalizations for what they're perceiving, but all of them are, of course, terribly wrong.
Right. And I'll get to this later. Like, it's cool if you have beliefs about how something may be. And I really do try to do a good job of emphasizing, like, look, I don't know for sure, but I believe this.
Yeah.
But that's not what's happening with academia, with the scientific community. They're trying to pass off what are fundamentally beliefs as empirical evidence or objective fact.
Yeah.
And then they coerce and threaten and manipulate and in some cases force people and organizations and entities to adopt their approaches based in what is fundamentally unproven beliefs. Like, there's nothing wrong with having beliefs at all. I have them.
Yeah.
I have beliefs too. And I admit overwhelmingly that they're beliefs. And when someone calls me out on like, how do you know that? I'm like, in my experience, it's this, or I believe this because X, Y, and Z, but I'm not trying to coerce or threaten or force anyone else to adopt my perspective. And that's overwhelmingly what the system does, which is why it would behoove of us to understand where the burden of proof lies. And when it comes to scientific claims, which require that you employ the scientific method, that you hold their feet to the fire with the scientific method and see if it actually adheres to it. And
before you get injected.
Before you can before you ever even consider getting injected.
Who, what, why, where, when, and how.
I love that. And it's funny because that relates to like the elements of a mission statement in the Army, which I really love. There's some positive things that I learned in the Army, despite my problems with it.
Well, there's some positive things I learned in the Army, and I'll tell you one of them. I think I mentioned it to you before. Basic battlefield strategy.
Yes.
The first 2 things you do if you want to win a war is knock out their communications and cut off their food supply. What's the first things we saw happening with COVID? Extreme censorship, and 150 or 120 food factories blew up, and there's shortages of everything everywhere. I'm like, okay, this is like Paratrooper 101. Get ready to take over your enemy from the inside out.
Right.
I mean, as soon as I saw this shit going on, I'm like, people are completely and utterly fucking clueless as to what's going on right now. And guys like me and you put ourselves at risk because we had enough balls to actually care about people enough to say, fuck, I've got to tell people to wake up.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not ending right now too. Like the same thing with respect to the food supply, cutting off the food sources is happening right now. And it all goes back to what I just said about virology. Employing nonsensical PCR tests. There are no such thing as it pertains to virology, at the least, of false positives. All of the results are inherently false because there is no evidence that these nucleic acids, which are alleged to be coming from a virus, have ever been proven to come from viruses. They're nucleic acids and genetic material of unknown origin, and then they employ these nonsensical tests, which are derived from those using PCR. They'll test one chicken, and if that one chicken, quote, tests positive, they'll just immediately kill all the other chickens who have come into contact with it, irrespective of whether they test positive or not. So that's why this matters. Like, fighting just, again, assuming that the foundation is true without actually holding, again, the feet to the fire in accordance with the scientific method, assuming that, virology must be true, so let's just fight for freedom as it pertains to vaccines and things like this. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. That is still an element of what we should do. But how is that going to help us solve the problem of them perpetually killing chickens and other animals that are, quote, testing positive for H5N1 and these other nonsensical viruses? They're still coming for this food supply because we're buying into this false belief, because we're not understanding the need to employ a tool like empiricism. So you asked another question related to what might be the explanation for two more people getting sick in the same space. And you just brought up how in a home environment, when multiple people or even just the mom experiences emotional stress, that can trickle into the other members of the family. That's absolutely one of the plenty of other possible explanations related to this phenomenon of two or more people getting sick in the same space. Shared emotional stress, shared perpetual fear, et cetera, et cetera. I've seen it in my own home. I'm a father. I'm sure you've seen it as well. There's times when I'm incredibly stressed out, which leads to me feeling symptoms of illness. And it's such a gut check. It's such an incredible reminder. Kids are such a mirror, where when I'm perpetually stressed, I see my kids start to get sick as well. I'm like, oh, I need to check myself. I need to come back into emotional regulation, regulate my nervous system. I need to feel my feelings to completion. So that's one possible explanation.
If I could just interject there, there's also, think about my analogy earlier of the bicycle wheel. In a family or a tribe, we attenuate stress through each other.
I'm getting to that too.
I was going to point out, though, that in my career working with orthopedic injuries, it's really common after I noticed that if one of the spouses, husband or wife, has had a chronic orthopedic injury, but back pain's a really good example, for about 5 years or longer, that there's a high incidence of their partner having the same injury. And there's actually literature on this. I read it years and years ago because I kept seeing this happen. And it had something to do with shared emotional stress was what the researchers pinned it down to. But it's actually like a form of empathy to take on that pain yourself. And if you study shamanism, it's very common for a shaman to allow a person's disease, emotionally, mentally, or physically, into their body so that they can then go into the inner laboratory of themselves and use their spiritual intelligence to try to figure out what it is that's actually happening to the person. And so they will often take on the illness or the pathology of the individual. They can clear it, but they actually describe in some of the literature I've studied of shamans talking about how they do this, about how they literally take that illness or trauma into themselves, work with it, identify what needs to be done, and then they clear it out of themselves.
I have a book called Masters of the Living Energy, which is about the Quero people of Peru, and it talks about that as well. They're I forget the name of the shamans in that culture. I want to say it's I don't remember the name, but it essentially talks about the same thing, where they'll take the energy of that person and digest it in their primary energy center, like digest that emotional turmoil related to that physical expression of disease. I think it's well established across like cultures and shamanistic cultures across civilizations.
I've been doing it for a very long time, except what I do is I just empty myself. And so say you came to see me as a client, I just connect my energy field to your energy field after I've emptied and do what a shaman calls that emptying the bone, neutralizing your thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So it's like resetting your calibration system. And then I just connect to Alex and allow Alex's energy field to imprint me. And if all of a sudden my breathing gets shallow, or I feel my small intestines constrict, or I get pain in my neck, I'm able to actually feel what is happening inside of you. And then, of course, I know where to start asking questions and looking. But I think it's fairly normal for healers with some degree of empathic capacity to do that, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously.
Right. Totally agree. And then in addition to that, because like that is a huge component, I actually want to say that even in a lot of holistic approaches to health, they're severely overlooking the metaphysical aspects of the manifestation of physical symptoms.
And they're not holistic yet.
No, they're not. But a lot of them claim to be holistic oriented and overwhelmingly looked at. I'm speaking to like the functional medicine space.
Oh yeah,
Again,
yeah. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
But remember, Klaus Schwab claims to be a green revolution too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But so in addition to that, what happens when, as we're moving into the winter months and we're experiencing less sunlight exposure, which we require as human beings, which all life requires, we're spending less time outside, we're spending more time indoors, even if we're holistically oriented. You know, I'm sitting in front of a device right now. I can name a number of things around me that are producing non-native EMFs that are disruptive to my body, and it's pretty well established.
Yeah.
And we're living inside in an environment with toxic glues, toxic drywall, toxic everything. And I'm not saying that to scare people. That's not the case,
just a
but
fact.
it's just to be aware.
Yeah.
And what happens when we're doing that as we transition into winter, and we know that seasonal depression is a piece of it, so add that layer as well. What happens when we're doing that perpetually? Might it be that once our body reaches a threshold of toxicity because we're not sweating as much, we're not outside as much, we're not receiving that negative charge from the earth, we're not getting that sunlight, that our body reaches a threshold of toxicity and we start experiencing symptoms of illness? And because I live in community with all the people around me and I live in the same home, they might reach a threshold at the same time, and we might erroneously conclude that I passed an illness to you or you passed an illness to me, when it's just that our bodies are doing exactly what they're designed to do because we're not getting enough sunlight, we're not getting outside as much, we're inside more. That's one piece. And then what happens when you have an abrupt change from it being 90 degrees outside down to 30 4 days later, and then it goes back up again 4 days after that?
Well, I was just going to
say again?
I was going to share something. So when you finish your thought, I want to share something on exactly that.
Yeah. So what happens to your blood vessels? What happens to your mucosal lightings? What happens to your lymphatic system? What happens to your nervous system when you experience a drastic change in weather like that? And that's what happens a lot of the times when people will travel too. And again, there's a unique combination of all the factors that I've already named, that Paul has named, but I will continue to name. So I'm never saying that it's one single thing that is the cause. And that goes back to what Paul was discussing earlier, that's one of the major problems with modern medicine as it is, so-called modern medicine, allopathic medicine, and even a lot of these so-called holistic approaches to health, is that they assume one singular cause for the symptoms that are being expressed, right? And they also assume individual diseases. And I like the quote from Florence Nightingale: there are no distinct diseases, but distinct disease states. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, so what happens when someone travels from a cold environment to a hot and humid environment, and they're riding on a plane which is bombarded with non-native EMFs? They assume like, I traveled and I was exposed to a lot of people, therefore they passed a particle to me, without taking into consideration the shock to your body. What happens when you take a plant that's been growing in one environment, we know this as human beings, and then immediately bring it to a different environment? What happens to that plant?
It usually dies.
It usually dies, right? I'm not saying that's happening to us, but like, it is insane that we don't think along those same lines, and we just automatically conclude, I must have received a microbe from someone else who was sick.
Yeah. What I wanted to share is that, and I wouldn't expect people to know this without studying human physiology, but the thermoregulatory system of the human body is the most energy consumptive system of all systems in the body. Every biochemical reaction in your body is temperature dependent. Dead people don't breathe and they don't have biochemical reactions. The only thing that grows in dead people is hair, and it grows off of death. So when people, live in two temperature controlled environments, their thermoregulatory system gets weak. They can't adapt. This is why, for example, going from a sauna to a cold plunge is very, very good, because it gives your thermoregulatory system a wide range of exercise. And also, we don't have any concept of exercise for the arteriovascular tree.
Right.
And so what people don't realize is when you get into an ice bath, initially, the sympathetic system sends a huge surge of blood to the surface of your body to try to warm you, to protect your brain, nervous system, and organs. But then there's what's called the hunter's reflex, which is identified by when hunters fell through ponds. They found that within a short period of time, the sympathetic system would then turn the energy, it would close all the arteries to the surface and push all the blood to the core. Because if you lose your fingers, but you survive, you still survive.
Right.
So when we go into a cold plunge, if we stay in there up to the point that the skin starts to go numb, we're having a massive opening of the arteriovascular tree. But then as the hunter's reflex kicks in, we have constriction. So we actually can exercise the arteries and the valves and the whole vascular system. And in nature, we would have been going in rivers. We would have been dealing with snow and cold. And, so the point is when you think of the fact that the circulatory system is what's responsible for bringing in oxygen, nutrition, and removing waste, if it's weak, it's like having garbage truck drivers that only show up once in a while and farmers that smoke so much pot they forget to farm, and so you don't know when you're going to get any food.
Exactly.
And so we've actually created a situation where we are so sedentary on the inside. And, and this is even an issue for athletes. I coined the term 20 plus years ago, the fit sick people.
Yes.
Just because you got washboard abs does not mean you're a healthy person. I've analyzed, thousands of elite athletes and show you that they're as sick as most people. They're just fitter.
Yeah.
And I also say it's not a good idea to trade your liver or your adrenal glands for a pair of biceps or a set of pecs. Because if you push the body, because you can consciously drive your body and force it to exercise when your internal systems and instincts are saying you should be at home resting, but instead you're drinking Red Bull, Monster, and killing it in the gym doing fucking CrossFit. So what happens is you can actually force the body to metabolize its essential core resources to make muscle at the expense of your own healing and regeneration of your glands and organs. And so you get one-hit wonder athletes. They win a CrossFit competition or two, but then they spend the next 3 years dealing with chronic fatigue and chronic neck pain and back pain.
Right.
And how that's relevant is these are the actual states of most people in the world.
Right.
They're thermoregulatory deficient. Their circulatory system's deficient. The metaphor of the farmer is that the arrival of real nutrition and food that's actually clean and nutritious is very inconsistent. Their detoxification systems are crippled. They're scared to death because they watch too much shit on social media and the news and believe it. Mm-hmm. They don't ask who, what, why, where, when, and how. They don't pay attention to natural principles that we all know work because they've worked from the beginning of time, like getting enough rest. Hippocrates said sleep is man's best medicine. They don't pay attention to the quality of their food. They don't move their bodies enough. They don't get in the sunshine enough. They cover themselves with chemical-laden sun creams. And so when you add all that together, all you got to do is, which is what you're going to get into soon, is just tell people you're going to get sick from the virus, and that's enough to make them manifest the symptoms.
Exactly. And see, like when you name all those things that you just named, you're both putting on sunscreen. You live in a shared environment. You're both exposed to the same things. You're both eating the same way. You're both exposed to the same emotional stress. You're both exposed to the same seasonal changes. You both go to the same office where they're spraying a bunch of toxic cleaning products, assuming that it's killing viruses, when in fact, it's just causing people to become sick with the synthetic chemicals that it's made of. And then they have insane amounts of, Wi-Fi routers, and maybe there's a cell tower just nearby. When you're exposed to the same shared environment is what I'm getting at, you might conclude, if you have this fundamentally flawed belief, that you're passing something between you. Now, I'm a dad. I'm not going to sit here and claim that it isn't interesting when my kids get sick one right after the other. And I'm not going to claim that it is only those things that I just named that is the cause of two or more people getting sick in the same space. That's not what I'm claiming. Again, I'm just providing other possible explanations.
There's always X factors.
Right. And one of the other possible explanations to bring this into the equation is the National Institute of Health has coined the term the human biofield to describe the electromagnetic field that surrounds the human body. Now, if that sounds woo-woo to people, we know that human beings produce an electrical current. That's well established. Anything that produces an electrical current also produces a magnetic field. So the magnetic field that surrounds our body is called the human biofield. We know that the various devices that are around us, like this computer that we're on, for those that are listening or watching this, the device that you're tuning in on, communicate via overlapping fields, frequencies, signals, and things like this. Is it really that far of a stretch to conclude that, or to assume that we might have this same technology, except for it's more advanced?
Way more advanced.
Way more advanced, given that we as human beings are what designed these technologies in the first place.
Yep.
In our image, you could say.
Absolutely.
And so, given that, is it possible that when I've reached a certain threshold of toxicity, Paul, let's say you and I are rooming together for 6 months. So our fields are overlapping constantly with each other. And again, bring into the equation all the things that I just named before, that, okay, I've reached a certain threshold of toxicity. Maybe it's time for me to detoxify. And then that might communicate through my field. And let's say you've been doing a damn good job of getting outside. You've been doing a damn good job of regulating your emotions. Your body receives that information from mine. It's like, nah, I don't have that same threshold or anywhere near it. I don't really need to at this point. But then we also have Kevin over there, who's been our other roommate. I don't know, I just chose a random name, Kevin, who's there. And he's been under insane amounts of stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so my body communicates that energetically to him. His body's communicating energetically to me. We both conclude that it's time to detoxify. We might, again, erroneously conclude that a physical particle was passed. And people will say, well, why does it matter whether it's an energetic thing or a physical particle? Because energetic things don't require masks, don't require vaccines, aren't treating the symptom. And in fact, it's based in the understanding that this is a brilliant, beautiful, communicative mechanism between two or more people to come back to homeostasis. Has nothing to do with being fearful of something. It's like, wow, look how brilliant and beautiful our bodies are. Look how connected we are as human beings. So that's another piece. And
well, before you go on, I'm sure you've read Arthur Firstenberg's book, The Invisible Rainbow, right? And he talks about repeatedly, whenever they put up new radio towers or X-ray systems or television broadcasting systems, people got influenza all over the place.
Yep.
And the bees often left. I don't know if you remember the part in the book where there was a bee farmer not far away from a new, 100 megawatt tower that they put up. I can't remember exactly what the megawatts, but it was huge at the time. And the bee farmer got so pissed off, he came to the people building the tower with a gun. And he said, "You are killing my bees."
Right.
Because this tower is radiating waves that is killing them. And of course, they thought he was crazy, but now we have piles of research showing that's dead right. And as a side note, Steiner warned, there's two things that human life depends on, and when they reach a critically low level, life will cease to exist as you know it. Those two things are bees and trees. And if you look at some of the videos that are available out there that I've seen, even documentaries showing, for example, one, I think Arthur Firstenberg actually referred to this, but I've actually seen documentaries showing this. They put up a military radar system in Germany in the Black Forest, and in exactly the alignment that it was broadcasting, all the trees died. It killed them all. And then you got all these pictures of 5G towers. One of my friends from England sent me a picture of a 5G tower that was put in the apartment block that he lived in, and it was right next to a tree, and half the tree died on the side of the tower, and the other half still had green leaves, but half the tree literally died. And so when you start seeing all this stuff, you got to start putting two and two together, or you become a victim of your own unwillingness to think holistically and pay attention to what's going on all around you.
Right.
And yeah, but anyhow, continue. There's the problem with talking to me about this is there's so much stuff that I know about from all my research, and I do this for a living, that it makes me want to say, let's not forget about this. Let's not forget about that.
No, it's helpful. Yeah, and I was going to get into that too, because in addition to what you just said, there's some pretty interesting stuff being discussed by this lady who's a telecommunications whistleblower named Sabrina Wallace, that talks about how there might be some more nefarious things going on with respect to millimeter wave technology than we may understand, that these devices that we have around us are interacting with our biofield in a very, very direct way, let's say.
Yeah,
Like that.
there's plenty of Jack Cruz talking about that. There's a lot of videos on that. I've seen inside military training programs talking about exactly how they use these devices to control people's emotions, mind, purchasing impulses, scattering impulses. I did research probably in the year 2000, and I found a patented invention that was owned by the U.S. military, and it was a scattering device, and it looked just like a megaphone, and I read the patent. And they showed that all you had to do is point it at a crowd of people, and it would produce a frequency that would make people feel very anxious and scared and make them scatter. There was a bunch of things you could do with this
Active denial system was another example of that. That's another millimeter wave based weapon employed by the U.S. military as well.
Yeah. Our point is, it would be naive to not think that these technologies are being used for nefarious purposes.
Most people nowadays have some trouble with poor blood sugar balance from stress, inactivity, and suboptimal sleep. Or if you're like me, you get too busy and skip a meal and then get so hungry that you crave sugar, stimulants, or a quick fix snack. But the blood sugar roller coaster that this creates is just not good for your body and can cause your cells to become resistant, and that may lead to belly fat, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular diseases, and many more issues. Berberine breakthrough by bioptimizers can significantly blunt those sugar cravings and help avoid the energy roller coaster. Stabilizing your blood sugar balance has so many other positive benefits, including supporting a healthy hormone balance, elevating your mood, and keeping brain function healthy. Glucose is also a type of oxidizing sugar, which means high blood glucose can increase oxidative stress and accelerate aging. So if you want to live a long and healthy life, you want to keep your blood sugar even-keeled. Berberine breakthrough by bioptimizers is clinically tested to potently normalize blood sugar response and is an invaluable tool in your nutritional toolbox. Spirit Gym with Paul Chek listeners can get 10% off their purchase of Bioptimizers Berberine Breakthrough by going to bioptimizers.com/Spirit Gym and use the code PAUL10 at checkout. Bioptimizers offer a 365-day best product ever or your money back guarantee, so you have nothing to lose and everything to gain by trying Berberine Breakthrough. That's bioptimizers.com/Spirit Gym and use the code PAUL10 at checkout for 10% off.
Right, exactly. And that's not to mean that we should be in fear, because I really want to emphasize this, and I'll emphasize it again later on, that I think that we have with our body the most incredible, beautiful, brilliant, intelligently designed thing that has ever existed in this realm. That's what we are experiencing this reality through. Everyone who's listening to this, everyone who's watching this, and by focusing your thought energy on bringing yourself into coherence, by focusing on your heart, which produces the strongest electromagnetic field of the body, by bringing your awareness there, coming into heart-brain coherence, I think that we can overcome any of this stuff that's being thrown at us. And if you look at the work of Dr. Masaru Emoto, Veda Austin, also bringing in Dr. Joe Dispenza, Bruce Lipton, Greg Braden, even Daniel Roitis, what he's shown with mass psychogenic illness, mass social contagion, that can work on the negative side of things and also the positive side of things. One's own beliefs about their health and orienting their thought energy towards something can actually manifest real symptoms or real healing associated with those beliefs. I think this is pretty well established at this point, and that works on the individual level as it comes to your own symptoms, but also like the concept of an egregore. When people focus all of their thought energy towards a specific outcome, it actually creates a sort of energetic distortion, possibly related to that thing, that brings about results based on that in material reality.
Well, yeah. I mean, I not only have I studied egregores, but I've seen many of them because I'm clairvoyant, and they're not hard to see if you're clairvoyant. In fact, there's a great book by Jeffrey Hodson called Kingdom of the Gods, and there's other books written by C.W. Ledbetter, and he shows thought forms because he was a clairvoyant. He had an artist, so he shows you, for example, the thought form created by music being played in a church, and many other things. But basically, an egregore is the combined mental emotional experience of any group of people. So, for example, there's a lot of people that worship Jesus, and within the egregore of Jesus is every positive and every negative thing ever associated or linked to the thought, feeling, or emotion of Jesus, which ranges from, soldiers painting nasty messages to people in the Middle East. Here's one from Jesus while writing it on a bomb on a U.S. destroyer, all the way to singing onward Christian soldiers marching off to war with the cross of Jesus going on before in church, which Jesus probably vomits when he hears, and then all the love and all the good, tidings and good deeds. So an egregore is really a astral manifestation of the mental embodiment or image of any belief system or icon or anything. I mean, there's egregores for pretty much everything that people, anywhere you got an ism, a belief system, a cult, a religion, any such construct, you're going to have egregores. There's an egregore for every professional sports team, for example.
Right. Exactly.
And they're very real.
Yeah, and they're very real. And I mean, if that, I doubt if people are listening to your show that they'll even think this is woo-woo. They know that this is pretty well established. Yeah. But for those who may be skeptical of that idea, let's back up a little bit. So according to the CDC's own data, the second strongest risk factor for death associated with COVID, based on a study that was published in 2021 or 2022, done on 540,000 people who were hospitalized and subsequently died with a, quote, COVID label, found that the second strongest risk factor was fear/anxiety related disorders. So now let's back up a little bit more. Daniel Reuters, in his book, Can You Catch a Cold? And I'm sure he covered this on his show, but it's good to reiterate it, covers a variety of well-established incidences where two or more people or entire groups of people get sick, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with any supposed microbe. Again, supposed microbe in the first place, but in these cases, that wasn't even a factor. One of those examples is this situation that occurred in New Zealand where a patented antidepressant had just gone off patent, so a lot of companies could make their own generic version of it. So one of the generic versions of this antidepressant, a lot of people began reporting side effects to New Zealand's adverse events reporting system. And there are 27 common side effects being reported by the various people who are reporting, right? 27 common side effects. The mainstream media in New Zealand, for whatever reason, when they decided to run a story on this generic version of this antidepressant that was causing issues, only covered 6 of those 27 symptoms. So again, mainstream media transmitting this message to the masses saying, hey, there's this new generic version of this antidepressant. It's causing a lot of adverse effects. Be on the lookout for it if you're taking it. Here are 6 common things to look for, and only name 6 of those 27 symptoms. What then followed was that adverse events reports skyrocketed, but only in those 6 symptoms that were named by the mainstream media. So this is a perfect example of what's called mass psychogenic illness, where one's own belief about something hearing a message, receiving it. And if you're not aware of how we are all subject to being programmed in that way, you can actually manifest physical symptoms related to that thing. And that happens individually and on a collective level as well. So what might happen, and again, I'm not saying that this is the cause of loss of taste and smell, but what might happen if from the very beginning of 2020, we are told over and over and over and over and over and over again by the media, by the government, by our friends and family, you know you will get this virus because you'll experience loss of taste and smell. You'll experience loss of taste and smell. You'll experience loss of taste and smell over and over and over again. And people will attribute this to SARS-CoV-2, which has never been demonstrated to exist. And people think this is a new symptom in and of itself anyway.
Right.
But just minor touch point on loss of taste and smell. I wrote an article on this specifically because this is one of the most common questions I get is, well, how do you explain loss of taste and smell? Okay, so there's an article that came out in the LA Times in 1988 that openly discusses loss of taste and smell and how people who experience the common cold frequently experience loss of taste and smell. So I'm just going to read, if I may, Paul, if you don't mind, just a little piece of that article.
Please
and
do.
This article is from 1988.
After that, I got two comments to share.
Yep. Okay. This article from the LA Times, 1988, Sense of Smell Can Be Victim of Bout with Flu. That's the article title. If you recently suffered from the flu and have not recovered your sense of smell, you aren't alone, researchers say. It can happen to people who suffer from flu or upper respiratory infections, said Robert Frank, a University of Cincinnati psychophysicist. It is common for sufferers with colds or the flu to lose their sense of smell and as a result their ability to taste briefly during the time of the ailment. But Frank said some people do not regain their sense of smell for months or longer. These people are seeing us 6 months after the flu has passed and they still don't have their sense of smell. We still don't even know if it's permanent or not. We don't know for sure right now, but we think there may be people who permanently lose their sense of smell after this kind of episode. After a period of time, some victims report sensing a persistent strange odor, which a lot of people reported from 2020 on. Researchers have not determined what this means, Frank said. So again, this is published in 1988, and there are a number of examples of, again, archived Google searches where you can type in loss of taste and smell, and you will find that WebMD back in the day talked about how one in 3 people who experienced the common cold also experienced loss of taste and smell. So this is not a new phenomenon in and of itself, but nonetheless, when it is being broadcasted to the masses through the mainstream media, through the government, through friends, family, et cetera, that you will experience loss of taste and smell. We're all impressionable. This is pretty well established in psychology and really like MK Ultra-esque experiments done by the CIA and other government organizations that we are incredibly impressionable at that level. And then when multiple people focus on a negative outcome, I think, again, I don't know, it creates a sort of ripple in the morphogenic field of mankind where, or you could call it an egregore, where we actually do start experiencing those physical symptoms related to that thing that we are all perpetually focusing on.
Yeah. Are you at a good point for me to share some thoughts?
Yes, please jump in.
Well, one, sense and smell loss can also come from toxicity. If you start looking up the symptoms of various toxic levels, which I had to do because I've rehabilitated a lot of firemen, and a lot of them end up with cancer from the toxicity from burning buildings. But when you start looking up like the chemicals in paints, asbestos, carpets, the things I've been looking up for years, you'll find any one of the senses from vision to all of them can be negatively impacted. And our sweat is an organ of detoxification. Like I like to vaporize tobacco and herbs, and I know when I can smell it in my armpits, it's time to get into the sauna or do a good circuit workout and sweat that stuff out of me. So, and that goes right back to our earlier discussions as whether or not, are we dealing with a virus or are we actually dealing with something that's toxic and poisoning us? Because there's plenty of information on what's in those vaccines, and there's a lot of toxic shit in there. The other thing when it comes to us taking each other's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors on is the science of mirror neurons.
Right.
And there's tons of great research showing And in fact, in neuro-linguistic programming, I remember because Tony Robbins used to be a client of mine for quite some time in the late 80s, early 90s. And he primarily teaches neuro-linguistic program, but he teaches a technique called leading and pacing. And he says, for example, if you're talking with someone that talks really, really fast, then what you do is you meet them and you talk like they're talking, but then you slowly slow your speech down, and without them even knowing it, they will slow their speech down. This is all happening through mirror neurons. You can go watch a movie, say a John Wayne movie, and find yourself walking out of the theater like John Wayne with, bow-legged walking or talking like Clint Eastwood, where our mirror neurons do this to help us fit into the environment and even cloak predators so that we seem less threatening to them. The other one is the number one threat that's been used by, the powers that be behind this pandemic and all such mind control games is death. And one of the fundamental issues that I repeatedly run into, and this is why I did so much research on God and studied all the world religions and everything related to it, is because we have 3 Abrahamic religions, all of which believe God will burn you in hell for sinning.
Right.
And they each have a long list of what a sin is. And just to make this point to my students, I tell them, you go get the scriptures from each of the major world religions, and you write down what their commandments or demands of God are, and what their food restrictions are, what their dance restrictions, their clothing restrictions, their sexual restrictions are, and look at them side by side and ask yourself, do we have one God or do we have 12 different gods? It'll be blatantly obvious you got 12 different gods, so they clearly can't be talking about God because there's only one God. The problem is that when we have 85% of the world's population claiming religious affiliation, and most all those gods will burn you in hell, then the thought of dying is actually not as bad as the fear of having to meet God and be judged and punished and burned in hell for your sins, because in the Christian ideology, that purgatory goes on forever.
Right.
So when I'm a therapist and I say, what's the most important impact on a person's psyche? It's their beliefs about God. And Carl Jung showed that, first of all, the imago Dei archetype, which is the image of deity, one's beliefs about God, is not only the source of all other archetypes, which is every function in your mind, but he makes it very clear that to the degree that your ideas about God are threatening and scary, it's going to probably lead you to a lot of fear, insecurity, neurosis, anxiety, illness, and disease, because there's no way you can run from that threat. So just to sort of round out the completeness factor of thinking holistically, we have to say, okay, what's the impact of having a God that is so nasty and vile and treats women terribly and treats human beings terribly and has a dysfunctional relationship with humanity? Well, it's no better than having a dysfunctional relationship with your father, who beats you and repeats the same behaviors, or treats women like shit, or his daughter like shit. And we already know what the outcome of that is just from human relationships.
Right.
And when God is the highest power in somebody's belief system, I tell my students, you must be aware of what that word means. What you believe is what becomes live. Be live. You make it live inside of you. It goes like until a child learns that God will burn them in hell for touching their genitals, there's nothing there to threaten them. But once they learn about it, now the belief becomes live.
Right.
And people forget the word television literally means tell a vision, implant a vision in somebody. So I often have to work with people at their core belief systems, because your earliest belief systems imprint all successive belief systems. Just like if you have a dysfunction in the roots of a tree, it'll imprint itself into every cell in the tree, because that's where it's getting its nutrition from. That's where it's feeding and supporting itself from. So if you really want to heal and use your mind holistically and become stable in your heart and in your center. It's very, very important to do what's really called shadow work and go through your beliefs very carefully and ask yourself, is this really serving my highest good? Is this creating wholeness in me? Is this creating a sense of connection in me? To self, to others, to the world, to the cosmos, and to God. And very few people have ever taken the time or even considered looking through their own mind to see whether that's a safe place to live or not.
Right. You know what? And that's such an important point, Paul. And it like sort of relates to everything that we're talking about here on belief systems themselves. Like the only thing, in my opinion, ironically, that someone can actually conclude if they continue to strip down everything, the only thing that someone can actually know with certainty is I exist.
And love.
That's it. Yeah, I exist and love. Right. That's the only thing that someone can conclude with certainty. So that means that everything else is fundamentally based in a belief, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. So then why would you want to latch onto any limiting fear-based beliefs if the only thing that you can know with certainty is I exist and the rest are all belief systems?
Yeah.
What benefit does it have to buy into a belief system that is fundamentally destructive, that is fundamentally limiting, that is fundamentally fearful? I'm not saying that those don't serve purposes at various points in your life. I do think that. But if we're going to analyze our psyche and do the shadow work, I mean, ultimately, for people who do the deep shadow work, let's say they've harmed a lot of people, they ultimately come back to their own innocence. They come back to their own understanding that they were just perpetuating the toxic belief systems that were impressed upon them.
That's called indoctrination, and that's where it all begins, right? And it's
exactly.
That's one of the dangers of having unenlightened parents. And I will quote a quote I've said on the podcast many times, but it's worth repeating. And if you want a great book to read, it's called The Crest Jewel of Discrimination by the Hindu philosopher sage Shankara.
I'm writing that down.
The Crest Jewel of Discrimination by Shankara.
Crest Jewel. Got it.
Okay. Shankara said, no man can understand Scripture until he's enlightened. And when he's enlightened, he does not need Scripture. Okay? Now, that's very true. Now, here's the problem. What percentage of people teaching Sunday schools or any religious studies worldwide at any given time are actually enlightened? Well, you'd be lucky if 1 out of 6 billion. Osho says it takes 6 billion people to produce one truly enlightened person. So what we've got is just a bunch of cut and paste photocopy bullshit of everybody else's lame interpretations, unskilled interpretations. And Manly P. Hall has a great book, I think it's called How to Interpret or How to Interpret and Understand Your Bible. And when he shows you what it takes to actually understand any scripture, how much background study you do, how you have to know the root words and the languages, the etymology, and even in the time and the place that the myths were common and generated, it's very scholarly. And I was blown away at Manly P. Hall's description of what Noah's Ark really is. When you actually read what it really is, and within half an hour reading that book, you will easily come to the conclusion 99% of the people in practicing religions haven't got a goddamn clue what it is they believe in. They're just memorizing it and believing it and suffering the consequences of it. And that's why I studied comparative religion. I've read every book Houston Smith ever wrote, and he was considered by everybody in the field the world's greatest expert on world religion. And there's lots more I could say, but you know, I'm just trying to make the point. To think holistically, you have to live holistically. Because if you don't live holistically, you will not have the energy to do the work that real thinking takes.
Amen.
David Bohm, you know who David Bohm was, right?
No, I don't.
Oh my God. There's a great documentary on his life on Amazon. Go search Amazon and just type
Man, you're
in.
giving me all these nuggets. I have to look up what the real meaning of Noah's Ark is according to Manly P. Hall. You dropped that one, and I'm like, damn, I want to know now.
Oh shit, dude! Right next to me, right there, is over 500,000. I got over 5,000 excellent books. Many of my friends sleep in that library when they come here because they can't.
I'm gonna play that part back to my wife because she gets mad every time I order new books, and that's gonna make her feel a little bit better.
Yeah, mine knows better. We just write them off as work expenses because they're tools for me and they're tools for you too.
Smart.
But anyhow, I was going to tell you about
David Bohm.
Oh yeah, David Bohm invented a very profound theory of quantum physics because it was so mind-boggling, and his theory is still highly referenced today, and it's excellent. And David Bohm was one of probably the deepest, most spiritually evolved scientists that ever lived. He spent 20 years working with Krishnamurti. He was a deep meditator, but a genius. I mean, an absolute genius. I've studied David Bohm's work extensively, and it's mind-blowing. But the documentary on Amazon is a really beautiful look at his life. But Bohm said two things. One I've shared before, but he said, no man can do deep thinking until he has healthy rituals. Why? Because that's what it takes to stabilize your mind enough to do the work. Remember, the brain's only, it's 5% of our body weight, and it uses 80% of the available blood sugar whenever you're cognitively engaged. So it's a very inefficient energy vacuum. Most people remember leaving tests in school and feeling exhausted, even though they did no exercise that day. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a holistic life to do holistic thinking, or it's just not going to happen. When people are physically tired, they're mentally lazy. That's just simply put. It's a fact.
Amen.
So anyhow, those were a few of the things that I wanted to share. Hi, guys. What do you reach for when you want a little pickup, when you want a little happy making? There's lots of things that I used to love. For example, I used to love my espresso in the afternoon, but that caused me lots of problems. So I had to retool that one. There's a lot of things that have sugar in them, but my body hates that. If you want to be healthy and you want to be clean, there's not much you can do. But Organifi's got some new happy drops that, believe me, are really good. And they're simple. They've got passion flower, go-to cola, organic saffron, and ginger root extract. And these things are awesome. You put a couple in your mouth. I like to suck them and let them melt down slow. And in a few seconds, you are feeling happy again with a little mood elevation and a little energy lift too. I absolutely love these things. My kids love them. And the thing I love about them is they make me feel good without doing anything but good for me. So if you want to get some happy drops, go ahead and try these. You're going to be amazed. I absolutely love these things, and my kids love them too. And I know you're going to love them. And you don't have to feel guilty about it because there's nothing in there that's bad for you at all. Far better than an addictive anything, and great for you. Try Organifi's Happy Drops.
To try Organifi's new Happy Drops and to get 20% off your order, go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20 at checkout. That's Organifi.com/Chek20. Organifi.com/CHEK20. And the promo code is CHEK20 for a 20% discount.
Awesome, Alec. Man, I'm having so much fun with you. I wish you lived closer to me so we could share bags and hang out in my library and get into every damn thing. Yeah. But we're coming down the pipe now, so why don't you share whatever you wanted to share that you think's important, and I'll do my best to not interject too much.
All good. So just to round out where I was going with that, like we covered the other possible explanations for contagion. It may seem like we're on this like long journey and various diatribes related to some of that stuff, but the whole point is when we're talking about holistic thinking, why it's necessary in this day and age, in the age of information, when we're bombarded with information from a variety of angles, it is important that we analyze the various claims, especially if they are fear-based claims, or especially if they are claims related to someone who presumes themselves to be an authority figure, an expert, et cetera, trying to get us to buy into things, orient our life, make health decisions, make familial decisions related to said claim. So my framework, just to reiterate, is based in the neti principle, which is a means of seeking truth through falsification. And when we talk about falsifying cause and effect claims, we employ something like the scientific method, which is based in knowing of the body, using your five, well, not just your five, but your five primary senses and the other senses that you have in order to see if something stands up in physical reality related to cause and effect claims. So when someone, go ahead, Paul.
If there's one thing I wanted to share, you never shared where neti comes from. Neti as a principle was used by the ancient yogis as a means of exploring themselves and God.
I said that at the beginning.
Oh,
I
did
said
you?
That at the
Okay, I
beginning.
did.
Yeah, I said that at the beginning. Yeah.
But that's
I said I've sort of reformed that, and I got to give a shout out to both Mark Gober and Dr. Tom Cowan on that one through conversations with them.
Yeah,
I reformed that approach to fit a means of falsifying claims from other people in reality. It's a means of trying to seek what is true. When someone makes a claim, okay, let's analyze that claim. Let's falsify that claim.
Yeah.
In accordance with the scientific method, and if it doesn't stand up to scrutiny in accordance with the scientific method, then it is an unproven claim. So it can't be that. It must be something else. So the point that we used infectious diseases throughout the course of this conversation as a means to sort of analyze how we could do that. So they make claims surrounding viruses, surrounding 2 or more people getting sick in the same space. It's not that. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny in accordance with the scientific method. So let's begin exploring with childlike wonder, stepping out of fear. What are the other possible explanations for this phenomenon? That's what's amazing when you employ something like this. You can analyze the various fear-based claims and look at them and be like, well, it's clearly not that. So what might it be? And then you get to explore, if you're open with childlike wonder and curiosity, what might be the actual cause of this phenomenon? I don't know, but I get to explore it. And that's what's beautiful. So the knowing of the mind, we're moving up from the body. Again, empiricism, your 5 primary senses and the other senses that we absolutely have, employing those to analyze cause and effect claims using something like a scientific method in order to falsify. Move up to the level of the mind, and that's where we can employ, as a means to falsify, logical fallacies.
Yes.
So we can snuff out bad arguments, bad positions, unproven beliefs by employing logical fallacies. And again, I'll paint that against so-called infectious diseases. Someone says, I know that I caught X virus because I experienced Y symptom. Okay. First off, X virus has not been proven to exist. So you're already doing what's called circular reasoning or begging the question. You're presuming that it exists without establishing that it does. When you are presuming your conclusion in one of your initial premises, that is circular reasoning or begging the question. But likewise, if you're pointing to effects as proof of the cause, that's also affirming the consequent, which means that, I'll give a very childlike example here. Let's say you and I are at a basketball game in the 1950s. And 1950s because we don't have cell phones, for the sake of the argument. And every time this one player, Mookie Jones, dunks, the crowd goes, ooh, a very distinct ooh when he dunks. So at one point during the game, I'm bending down to retie my shoe, and I hear the crowd go, ooh. I turn over to you, Paul, and I'm like, oh, Mookie must have dunked, right? Because that effect is proof that Mookie dunks. And you're like, no, Mookie's sitting on the bench. The referee just got punched, and that's why they made the noise. It's like, no. That effect is proof that Mookie dunked. That's an affirming the consequent.
Right.
Unless you clearly establish that the only way this effect can occur is because of that one singular cause, you cannot point to said effect as proof of the cause. And we all do this in our lives, but the scientific establishment in a variety of ways, when it comes to climate, so-called science, when it comes to cell biology, when it comes to virology, when it comes to virtually all health sciences, does this all the time, where they point to an effect as proof of a cause.
Yeah.
And that effect could possibly be evidence of that cause, but you need to establish a clear cause and effect relationship. Or if someone says, I lost my taste and smell, therefore I know I contracted this gain of function lab-made virus. Are we sure? Going back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, there are plenty other possible explanations for loss of taste and smell. Repetitive exposure to non-native EMFs, toxin exposure, mineral imbalances, fear-based beliefs that are perpetual. There are a variety of things that can lead to one or more people experiencing loss of taste and smell. Are you positive that it was caused by this? So when people point to effects as proof of cause, that's a logically fallacious argument. Likewise, if people refer to expert opinion or expert consensus, that's both an appeal to authority and a bandwagon fallacy wrapped up in one. That does not take the place of empirical evidence, nor is it logically consistent. So that's just a brief summary of how you can employ something like logical fallacies in order to falsify various claims coming from the establishment. And if you really learn logical fallacies well, and also learn the scientific method, as I said, just those two alone can be tremendous tools in order to pull yourself out of fear as it pertains to various scientific figures. And I'm talking about on the mainstream and alternative side, making claims that are fear-based.
It's kind of like the saying correlation is not causation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It can be, but it often is not.
Absolutely. It can be, but until you establish a direct causal link, if you're looking at epidemiological observations, which, ultimately leads into the argument correlation does not equal causation, which is true. If you're just looking at epidemiological observations, those can be manipulated.
Absolutely. Statistics can really completely skew people's opinions, and that's one of the greatest ways to manipulate people.
Right.
Exactly. And this is the other problem with algorithms as well. I often give my students an analogy given by Marie-Louise von Franz, who was Carl Jung's assistant for a long, long time. And she makes the point, you can have a pile of stones that is 2 tons of stone with an average weight of 2 kilograms and weigh every single stone and not find a single stone that weighs 2 kilograms.
Exactly.
And so when we're dealing with medical research that's looking at large numbers of averages, it's totally overlooking the unique individuality of every single person, which is why I encouraged you to read Biochemical Individuality by Roger Williams. And the reality is we are as different on the inside as we are on the outside. He showed, for example, that even within the same family, there could be a 1,000% difference in the liver's capacity to clear caffeine or alcohol. So
I believe it.
That's a tremendous variance for the same gene pool.
Yeah. It's incredible. Yeah. I got to read that book.
It's a really good book.
So that's, again, knowing of the body, knowing of the mind, and then we move to knowing of the spirit. A lot of people would refer to this as intuition. I don't like to call it intuition myself, simply because the way that I take intuition to mean is that it is one's own volition, individual volition, and individual understanding, individual internal knowing, you could call it, that is leading to those conclusions. When I think it's a dance between us and our creator. So for lack of a better term, this is not the actual definition of mysticism. I've called it either like intuitive mysticism or just mysticism itself. It's you're in communion with the creator, with all things around you, in order to snuff out what is fundamentally against God, what is fundamentally against the creator, and what is fundamentally against life. And that requires that you are a clear vessel. That requires that, just like you said, Paul, you live holistically. Mm-hmm. Because the more that you approach your life in a way that is in accordance with natural principles, getting back into the natural world as much as we can, the more that you are going to receive that inherent wisdom inside you and snuff out all of the nonsense that is occurring in the world. And that's how so many people like you, like many others, were able to instantly know, despite any of the evidence coming out, without even any evidence coming out yet, just based on the headlines that, this is bullshit.
Yeah.
What's happening here is total bullshit. And that's falsification on the level of the spirit, as I like to call it.
And how it was happening.
And how it was happening, exactly. So that's sort of my framework for thinking, but it also plays into the Cartman drama triangle, which is the traditional victim, perpetrator, hero triangle that the mainstream system is always trying to wrap us up in.
It's at the core of almost every successful movie.
It's at the core of almost every successful movie and every successful psyop that has occurred throughout history that I can think of.
It works on archetypes. It's playing on the human psyche. The archetype, without archetypes, you have no mechanism for making meaning.
Right.
So that what they do is they play with your meaning-making faculty and try to manufacture meaning through illusion.
Right. Exactly. And so when you have the context of this framework, whether it's Paul's framework for holistic thinking, which is absolutely incredible, and he's been doing this much longer than me, and it's probably much more well thought out than mine is, but mine, and you employ these things and also have the lens of, okay, how are they trying to condition me to be in a perpetual state of victimhood? How are they trying to condition me to be fearful of some perpetrator? And how are they trying to condition me to outsource my power to some hero that is going to step in to save me from the perpetrator because I am a victim?
And how are they trying to punish me for not following the instated belief system and separate me from others that are?
Absolutely.
As Ken Wilber says, and others, about 70% of the world population is still, regardless of biological age, is still in the child archetype, which you can thank religion largely for doing in institutions. But because you have 70% of the world population in the child archetype, they're very dependent on mommy and daddy figures,
right,
as a sense of safety and security and support. And when you look at some of the elite people who we would never have expected to get vaccinated, and how they did, and how many people have fallen back and reverted back into hardcore Orthodox Christianity through the pandemic.
Yes.
You see that whenever an individual's under stress, they revert backwards in their psychological development because the unconscious processes information instantaneously without cognitive thought. That's why I say, and people forgive me for saying it again, but you never throw in a cartwheel if you're running from a lion. You don't want to use an act of creativity when you need a survival instinct, because you'll climb a tree and not even know how you got up there, but it might save your life.
Absolutely.
So when we get pushed into these fear-based situations, we revert back in consciousness. And for most people, it's only one step backward to being right in the hands of a mommy daddy figure. And that's how all cults are run. That's how all religions are run. With the exception of Buddhism that doesn't have a god, but there's plenty of little gods in Buddhism. But all religions are basically, well, the Eastern religions are what Osho calls adult religions because they really put the onus of your own development on you. But the Western religions, you have an authority figure, you have a church, you have a priest, you have a medium between you and God, even though Jesus said very clearly, lift the stone and I will be there, split the wood and I will be there, which just means God is everywhere. You don't need to go to a church. And that's the other way. Whenever you want to brainwash people, you confuse them with contradictory concepts. That's well known in brainwashing science. So if you read a book like the Bible, there is contradictions constantly throughout the Bible. If you've never read the book Setting God Free by Father Sean O'Leary, it's a mind-blowing read. It's one of the top 10 books in my library, Setting God Free. He's been on my podcast several times. He's an absolute genius, 50 years a Catholic priest who got excommunicated for teaching true spirituality.
Wrote that one down too.
It'll blow your mind. Just listen to any of my podcasts with him and you'll know immediately he's worth listening to.
But it's so interesting on all the points that you just made, because again, no knock on the Christian crowd. I want to be very clear here. A lot of my really good friends are Christians, and they get it. They saw through this whole paradigm.
Yeah.
They see through what I'm about to say next. But how many of the people who buy into the very dogmatic Christian paradigm also are falling back into that Cartman drama triangle,
Yeah.
where they look at the Democrats as the perpetrators.
Yeah.
They look at themselves as the victims of the Democrats. So then they buy into the hero
Yeah.
coming from the right,
Yeah.
because they're buying into the same thing with respect to their religious foundational belief systems. So it's going to show up elsewhere in the physical expression of their lives. And that's where they're buying into this illusion that someone in government is going to save them, whether they express that directly or not. That's what they're doing. How many people do you know, Paul, who are acutely aware of the need to dissolve the illusion that men and women who call themselves government have any moral right to dictate or give commands or initiate acts of aggression against those who don't comply, are now right back into believing in that paradigm simply because their hero in that drama triangle is now in office?
Oh, it's the exact problem with religion. And look, having studied religion for much of my life and been raised in it, there's two kinds of religion. There's authentic religion, which the function of religion was to create a set of principles, precepts, and guidelines to help hold a community together. It's well known that when tribes get to be bigger than about 55 people, they start falling apart. There's too much confusion and violence. So the authentic function of religion has two things. One, the function of a dogma is to maintain the teachings and practices that the founder of the religion used to reach enlightenment. It's when the dogma gets manipulated after they die that it becomes a means of controlling people. So you've got the dogma, which is actually the authentic teachings of the founder of the religion, which are supposed to be practices, not dictates. Then you've got the function of morality and ethics and virtues, which is what almost all myths hover around, especially Greek myths. And that is, what do we have to do to live together, to grow together, to learn together, and to create something that it takes a bunch of people working in harmony to create, because no individual can create anything significant by themselves. And anyone that says they can, I simply ask them, who made the boots you're wearing? Who made the toilet paper you wipe your ass with? Who made the car you drove here in? Like, we all need each other. That's one of the things that I was saying all the time, throwing all this bullshit, separating people from each other. I said, look, we need each other. We love each other's music. We love each other's food. We love each other's clothing and styles and dance. I mean, when you look at how much we love the variety that we each bring to each other, you can actually see there's a lot more love that holds us together than all this bullshit people are throwing at you. So before you start going out and being a racist and hating anti-vaxxers or whatever it is, look first at the principle of love and ask yourself, what is the most true? The most true thing is we do far better together. And diversity is critical to survival in nature. And when we have monocropping going on, we've got a very serious threat to our own survival.
Yeah, amen. Amen.
Anyhow, do you have some closing commentary and anything that you want to offer? I want to make sure you get a chance to share everything you wanted to share.
Yeah, so with thewayforward.com, which I'm sure Paul will link in the show notes, we're launching here soon a tool that will allow you to connect with like-minded people, like-minded practitioners, like-minded alternative schools, and like-minded farms near you. I get questions all the time, and I'm sure you do too, Paul, and I know a lot of people experience this, where they're trying to find their tribe. They're trying to find farms near them that they can buy directly from. They're trying to find alternative schools in their area, especially in this day and age when a lot of the Waldorf and Montessori schools have gone off the deep end and are not truly adhering to their own foundational principles. And likewise, a lot of naturopathic doctors, a lot of chiropractors have also gone off the deep end and are not adhering to their foundational principles in naturopathy
No
or chiropractic or Ayurvedic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. So it's really important that as I see it, as this system continues to try to centralize power and get us to play with their virtual tools, that we use those virtual tools as a means to connect back with local community. For example, I live in an area in Texas that has roughly 250,000 people in my immediate vicinity. I guarantee there are like-minded people in my vicinity, but I have no clue how to find them.
Yeah.
I guarantee that there are like-minded farms within my vicinity. I have no clue how to find them. So what we've developed with the Way Forward is a private-based organization where you come in and you can be sure that there's not going to be any nefarious actors in there. And you can type in your zip or postal code, set a geolocation, and it'll populate all of the like-minded people, all of the like-minded farms, all of the like-minded alternative holistic health practitioners around you of various types, and all of the alternative schools around you that you know are going to be like-minded, helping to connect people across the world with their in-person community. And it was a great segue from exactly what you said. We need each other.
Yeah.
We need each other more than ever at this point in time, especially with the various narratives and psyops and the ways that they're trying to divide us and put us in these identity groups. We need people who are employing holistic thinking, who are adopting the neti-neti principle, who are living a holistic lifestyle, to find each other, to begin building that parallel structure in their local area that makes that old system obsolete.
Absolutely. And I will share a closing comment of my own, and it'll be short and sweet. Always remember, phones and minds make better tools than masters. If your mind becomes your master, you will lose your heart. If your phone becomes your master, you will probably get the next vaccination they throw at you. And you will believe statistics made up by people toying with your mind in your pocketbook. So that's my closing comment.
Amen. I mean, well said.
Hey, what a great podcast. It's I feel like you're a long lost brother out there. We're both ex-soldiers and we can think straight and we care about people, and we share a lot of values together. And ever since I first heard you on a podcast, I just had a sense of, thank fucking God there's somebody like that, out there. And I say that when I hear Dr. Kaufman speak, or anybody that's, really helping people think straight and make better decisions and problem solve effectively and tell the truth. I mean, your country's in trouble when the CIA's stated motive is our mission will be accomplished when nobody knows what the truth is. That's when you're really in deep fucking trouble.
We're in the midst of that right now.
Totally.
Literally, that's what we're in the midst of right now, which is why it would behoove of you to adopt a framework or really start checking how I know what I know, or how do they know what they claim to know. Let's analyze this.
Well, we can turn it backwards on them. So I'll share this. There's a book by J.D. Hollandane called The Philosophy of Science. He says in that book, if a little bit of nonsense repeated regularly for just 10 years can wipe out 100 years of truth. And that's true. But I say, well, if that's true, a little bit of truth repeated regularly should wipe out 100 years of nonsense. And it's up to all of us to repeat truth regularly. So CIA, which is being used to wipe out the truth and manipulate us, can we take it backwards? Institute, CIA, so Association of Investigating Consciousness, neti-neti.
Did you just come up with that right now?
Yeah.
That was great.
The Association for Investigating Consciousness. That's us.
That's love that.
That's the neti-neti. That's the new neti-neti organization.
I love that.
By the way, if
great.
you want to find a bunch of people that share your values, just do a mass email to your neighborhood offer them a free vaccination and see what kind of responses you get. And you'll know when people tell you to fuck off, they're the people you want to hang out with.
Yeah, that's an easier way. I guess you don't even need to join the Way Forward. Send a mass email to your HOA or something like that.
My buddy Kyle Kingsbury, you know Kyle, don't you?
Yeah.
Kyle, he's one of my favorite people in the world. He said to me, Paul, I found a safe way to figure out who you can talk the truth to COVID about, talk with about the truth of COVID. I said, what's that? He says, just ask them what they actually think happened during 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
He said their answer to that tells you whether or not it's safe to talk about what's really going on with COVID. And I think that's a great litmus test.
That is a great litmus test. Incredible one.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, lots of love to you, Alec. Thank you so much. Let's not make this our last podcast. I hope this is the beginning of a long string of podcasts and a beautiful friendship and sharing of everything we can share to support each other and our families. And I want to say thank you to my sponsors for your love and support. All the sponsors put their money into organic farming, biodynamic farming, regenerative farming. So whenever you buy anything from my sponsors, you're not only buying something that's good for you, but you're buying something that supports companies that are ethical, moral, and support the planet and the farmers and the soil and the ecosystems. And it supports the podcast, so it's a win-win-win. And thanks for all of you for joining me and Alec today. We must be the change. If you're waiting for a mommy, daddy figure, or even Donald Trump to fix everything, you're still a child. Pray and move your feet. I'll be back in a week with something exciting and interesting. I don't know if I can top Alec Zeck, but I'll find you something worthy of engaging. And again, thank you, Alec. Keep being you, man. You're awesome.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it.
Lots of love, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Alec Zeck. You can connect with Alec on Instagram at The Way Forward, that's The Way, FWRD, and at _Alec_Zeck. Or find him online at his website, The Way Forward, at thewayforward.com. That's thewayfwrd.com. There you can listen to his podcast, search the database of businesses committed to ethical practices and shared values, and join the Way Forward community. Check out the online educational experience, The End of COVID, at theendofcovid.com, where you can watch over 90 sessions with prominent voices such as David Icke, Kelly Brogan, Tom Cowan, Andrew Kaufman, Christine Northrup, and many more. Paul invites you to join his Spirit Gym program and community, where you can share ideas and ask questions about the topics discussed in this podcast. There are 3 different levels of membership to fit your budget and lifestyle. You can participate in live Q&A sessions with podcast guests, access the members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you can chat with other members, attend weekly virtual meetups with Paul, and study the comprehensive Master Key online program. Explore the options and subscribe today by going to myspiritgym.com. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.